You clicked because you can feel it. The air over Europe is shifting this July, and it is not behaving the way summer usually does. You have seen the record numbers. You have heard the word heat wave. But that is not the story anymore. Here is what meteorologists at the Copernicus Climate Service, the United Kingdom Met Office, and Météo France are now reporting. The extreme heat that shattered records across Western Europe in the final days of June did not simply pack up and leave. It moved. It sank into the sea. And the Western Mediterranean is now warmer than it has ever been measured for this point in the year. I want you to stay with me all the way to the end, because there is a single reading I found buried in the Copernicus Marine Service data, a sea surface temperature off the coast of Spain that barely made a single headline. That one number tells you what the rest of this summer could throw at Europe. And it matters no matter where you are watching from. I remember the exact moment this stopped feeling routine for me. It was late on the 30th of June, and I was refreshing the Copernicus surface analysis maps the way I do most nights. And the whole map of Iberia had gone a shade of dark red I do not see often. I actually stopped scrolling because the heat was not the surprise. The surprise was where it was going next. So let me walk you through this the way I have been tracking it, hour by hour, forecast run by forecast run, and I will show you what is expected in the days ahead. Let me start with what already happened, because you need the baseline to understand the shift. In the last week of June 2025, a dome of high pressure locked itself over Western Europe. Forecasters call this a heat dome, a ridge of high pressure so strong and so stubborn that it presses the hot air down, blocks the clouds, and lets the sun bake the same ground day after day after day. Nothing moves, nothing cools, the heat just compounds. And the numbers it produced were not normal. On the 28th of June, in the town of El Granado in southwestern Spain, the thermometer reached 46 degrees Celsius. That is close to 115 degrees Fahrenheit. The Spanish Meteorological Agency, AEMET, flagged it as a provisional national record for the month of June, the hottest June temperature ever recorded in the country. Let that sit for a second. Not the hottest day of the year. The hottest June day in the entire national record. The very next day, across the border in Portugal, the town of Moura recorded 46.6 degrees Celsius. Portugal's weather service treated it as a provisional June record for the country as well. 2 neighboring countries, 2 all-time monthly records in 2 days. But this did not stay in Iberia. The heat rolled northeast, and by the 1st of July, Météo France had placed 16 departments under its highest alert level, the red vigilance. That included the Paris region. Officials closed the summit of the Eiffel Tower to visitors. Across France, the Education Ministry reported that more than 1,350 schools were fully or partially closed because the classrooms were simply too hot for children to be inside them safely. Now, here is the part that most coverage stopped at. The headline said, "Record heat," showed the crowds by the fountains, and moved on. But I kept watching. Therefore, I want to show you the piece they skipped. Because a heat dome like this does not only cook the land, it cooks the water. And the water is where this story turns. Let me open the next layer for you, because this is where the shift meteorologists are now talking about actually lives. While everyone was watching the air temperature, the sea was quietly doing something extraordinary. The Mediterranean, especially the western basin between Spain, France, and the Balearic Islands, was heating up at a pace that stunned oceanographers. The Copernicus Marine Service and Mercator Ocean International, which run the operational ocean monitoring for Europe, reported that sea surface temperatures in the western Mediterranean reached record levels for June. In parts of the Balearic Sea, the water was running roughly 5 to 6 degrees Celsius above the normal for late June. Some coastal readings near the Spanish mainland climbed toward 30 degrees Celsius, which is around 86 degrees Fahrenheit. For a sea in June, that is astonishing. That is water that feels like a warm bath when it should still be cool enough to make you gasp when you first wade in. This is called a marine heat wave, and I need you to understand why it is not just a beach headline. Warm seawater is stored energy. It is fuel. The ocean holds heat far longer than the air does, and it releases that heat slowly back into the atmosphere above it for weeks and sometimes months afterward. So even when the land finally cools, the sea keeps breathing warmth and moisture upward. The World Meteorological Organization and Copernicus scientists have been explicit about the mechanism. A hot sea raises the overnight minimum temperatures along the coast, so the nights never really cool down, which is exactly when the human body needs to recover. It loads the lower atmosphere with extra water vapor, and it primes the region for a very specific kind of violent weather later on. Samantha Burgess, the strategic climate lead at the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts, which runs Copernicus, put the June situation plainly in the service's public reporting. Western Europe experienced its warmest June on record, and the marine heat wave in the Mediterranean was described as unusually strong and unusually early. So here is where I partially close the loop and then open the bigger one. The land heat was the visible event. The sea heat is the hidden one, and the hidden one lasts longer. That is the shift. The story is no longer only about how hot last week was, it is about the reservoir of heat now sitting in the water and what it does next. Which brings me to the countdown, to what the models are actually showing for the days ahead this July. If you want to go even deeper into how these systems work, the heat domes, the marine heat waves, and the autumn danger window before we get to the numbers that almost nobody reported, let me point you to something I put together outside of this channel. I wrote a book available as Storm Signal, Storm Intelligence, or Storm Alert, depending on the edition that walks through exactly this kind of analysis. How to read the source data, understand the mechanisms, and stay ahead of the pattern before it becomes the headline. If that sounds like something you want in your hands, the details are in the description below. Now, back to the data, because this is the part that most coverage stopped at, and it is exactly where the story turns. Let me be precise about the near term, because this is the part you can act on. In the first full week of July, the forecast models, including the European Center's own ensemble runs and the Met Office guidance, showed the ridge of high pressure beginning to break down over the northwest of the continent. A cold front started pushing in from the Atlantic. For the United Kingdom, Ireland, France, and the Low Countries, that meant the peak of the heat was expected to ease with cooler, fresher Atlantic air arriving and thunderstorms breaking out along the boundary where the hot air met the incoming cooler air. That sounds like relief. And in the immediate sense, for those regions, it is. But here is the paradox the forecasters keep pointing to, and it is the thing I most want you to hold on to. When a mass of extreme heat collides with incoming cooler, more unstable air, you do not just get a gentle cool down. You get the atmosphere violently rebalancing itself. You get severe thunderstorms, large hail, damaging wind gusts, and torrential, sudden downpours. And now layer the sea back in. All that extra moisture evaporating off a record warm Mediterranean feeds directly into those storms, making them wetter and more intense than they would otherwise be. Meteorologists have warned that the breakdown of a heat dome over a superheated landscape and a superheated sea is often more dangerous in the short term than the heat peak itself. We have watched this exact sequence before, so this is not speculation. This is pattern recognition based on how these systems have behaved. Therefore, let me move to the layer that most people underestimate because they think it only applies to the countries that made the news. I know some of you are watching this from somewhere that feels a long way from a Spanish record or a Paris red alert. Maybe you are in the north of the continent or across the Atlantic entirely, and you are thinking this is a Mediterranean problem, a Southern Europe problem, not yours. This next part is specifically for you because the science says the reach of this is wider than the map of the heat wave, and there are concrete things you can watch for wherever you are. First, understand what a marine heat wave does to weather far downstream. The atmosphere is one connected system. A large, persistent block of high pressure over one region, what forecasters call an omega block because of its shape on the map, forces the jet stream, that fast river of air high above us, to buckle into big loops. Where the jet loops north, you get the heat dome. But where it loops south on either side, other regions get dragged into unusually cool, wet, stormy conditions. So, the same locked pattern that bakes one country can flood or chill its neighbor. If your region suddenly swings into strange stuck weather this July, heat that will not quit or rain that will not stop, that is the fingerprint of the same blocked pattern. Second, here is what you can actually do, and it costs nothing. Learn the alert language of your own National Weather Service before you need it, not during the emergency. In France, it is the vigilance system, and red is the top level. In the United Kingdom, the Met Office issues yellow, amber, and red weather warnings, and it now also issues heat health alerts with the health agency. Across the United States, the National Weather Service issues excessive heat warnings and severe thunderstorm and flash flood warnings. The single most useful habit you can build is knowing what your top-tier alert word is, so that when it appears, you do not waste time wondering whether it is serious. Third, and this is the practical one that saves lives during heat, watch the overnight low, not just the daytime high. Forecasters stress this constantly, and the public keeps missing it. Your body can tolerate a brutally hot afternoon if the night cools enough for it to recover. When a marine heat wave keeps nighttime temperatures elevated, night after night, the heat stress accumulates in the body with no chance to reset. That is when heat becomes deadly, especially for older adults, for people with heart conditions, and for anyone without cooling. So if you see the forecast overnight low staying high, treat that as the warning sign and make a plan to get somewhere cooler, check on elderly neighbors, and hydrate before you feel thirsty. Fourth, if you are anywhere near a river, a dry stream bed, or a low-lying area during one of these post-heat storm breakdowns, respect the flash flood risk. Water off warm seas falls fast and hard. The ground baked by weeks of heat cannot absorb a sudden deluge, so it runs off instantly. Never drive into water across a road. It takes a shockingly small depth of moving water to lift a vehicle. So that is the bridge. Even if the heat itself never reaches you, the pattern behind it can. And now you know the three signals to watch: the stuck jet stream, the overnight low that will not fall, and the sudden violent storm when the heat finally breaks. But I promised you something specific from the data, and now we are close enough that I can hand it to you. Let me set it up, because the way I found it matters. I was going through the Copernicus Marine Service monitoring and the ocean analysis reporting for the Western Mediterranean, the part of the record that tracks the sea rather than the sky. And what struck me was not just that the sea set a June record, it was the shape and the timing of it. This marine heat wave arrived weeks earlier in the season than these events usually peak. The most intense Mediterranean sea heat normally builds through late July and into August. This one was already at record June intensity, with surface waters 5 to 6 degrees Celsius above normal in the Balearic Sea before the summer had really even started. Here is why that specific detail is the whole story, and why it should be on your radar for the months ahead. The Mediterranean does not release that stored heat quickly. Oceanographers describe the sea as having a memory. The warmth that loaded into that water in June carries forward, and there is a well-documented, dangerous consequence that European forecasters watch for every autumn. In Spain, it has a name. They call it a dana, an isolated depression at high levels, a pool of cold air aloft that drifts over the still warm Mediterranean in late summer and autumn. When cold air aloft passes over an abnormally warm sea, the temperature contrast is enormous, and that contrast is rocket fuel for storms. The warm sea pumps huge volumes of moisture upward into the cold air above, and the atmosphere unloads it as extreme, concentrated rainfall over a very short time. This is the exact mechanism behind the catastrophic flooding that struck the Valencia region of eastern Spain in late October of 2024, when more than 200 people lost their lives as a year's worth of rain fell in a matter of hours. Scientists directly linked the ferocity of that event to the unusually warm Mediterranean feeding the storm. So, connect the dots the way the data does. A record warm Mediterranean this early in June means the sea is starting the season with more stored energy than usual. And it has all of July, August, and September to hold and add to it. That does not guarantee another Valencia. Nobody can forecast a specific flood months in advance, and I will not pretend otherwise. But it does mean the loaded gun is on the table earlier than normal, and that is precisely what the marine monitoring is showing and what most of the heat wave coverage never mentioned. The headlines told you the beaches were warm. The Copernicus ocean data told you the sea was storing the fuel for the autumn. That is the reveal. The reading that almost nobody put on screen, a Western Mediterranean running 5 to 6 degrees above normal at record June intensity, weeks ahead of schedule. That number is not a beach forecast. It is an early warning for the second half of the year. Let me bring the whole timeline together now, so you carry it straight in your head. In late June, the heat dome broke national records across Spain and Portugal and pushed France to red alerts. In early July, the ridge began to break down over the northwest, bringing cooler Atlantic air but also the risk of violent thunderstorms where the hot and cool air collided, storms supercharged by the moisture off a record warm sea. And ahead of us, through the rest of the summer and into autumn, sits that reservoir of ocean heat, quietly holding the energy that these systems draw on, keeping coastal nights warm, and keeping the region primed for extreme rainfall when the atmospheric setup lines up. I want to be careful and fair with you, because that is the whole point of this channel. The immediate heat peak of late June has passed for now. The models do show relief moving through parts of Europe in early July. This is not me telling you a disaster is certain tomorrow. What I am telling you, straight from Copernicus, from the Met Office, from Météo France, and from the ocean monitoring, is that the ground state of the system has shifted. The sea is hotter and it got hot earlier, and that changes the odds for everything that comes after. Here is one more piece of texture the forecasters keep repeating, because I think it reframes how you should read the whole summer. These heat domes are lasting longer and setting up more often, and the pattern of the jet stream getting stuck, that omega block I described, is the common thread. When the jet locks, weather stops moving. And weather that stops moving is what turns an ordinary hot spell into a record, and an ordinary rain event into a flood. So the single most useful thing you can watch for all summer is not any one temperature. It is whether the pattern is stuck. When the same weather sits over the same place for 5, 6, 7 days and refuses to budge, that is your signal that the extremes are building whichever direction they run. Think about what it would have meant to know all of this a week before it hit. To know that the record was coming, that the sea was loading up, that the storms on the back edge could be as dangerous as the heat itself. That gap between what the source data was already showing and when the headlines caught up is the gap I try to close for you every single time. Because the truth is, the information was there. It was in the AEMET record notice. It was in the Météo France vigilance map. It was in the Copernicus June summary and in the Marine Service ocean readings. Most coverage grabbed the scary air temperature and stopped. The sea, the part that actually tells you about the months ahead, sat there in the data, largely unmentioned. Now you have it, and now you know what to watch. Here is what I want you to walk away feeling. Not fear, a step ahead. You now understand something about this European summer that most people scrolling past the headlines do not. That the real story moved from the sky into the sea, and the sea has a long memory, to watch the overnight lows, to respect the storms when the heat breaks. That a record warm Mediterranean in June is a flag for the autumn, not just a note about the beach. If you are the kind of person who would rather read the source and understand the mechanism than wait for a headline to tell you after the fact, then you already know why you are here. You want the real update, straight from the bulletin, while there is still time for it to be useful. So here is my question for you, and I read the replies, so be specific. Look at where you are right now. Is your weather stuck? Has the same pattern? Hot or wet? Been parked over you for days without moving? Tell me in the comments, and tell me where you are watching from, your country, your region, so I can see how this pattern looks across the map from the people actually standing under it. That is the part the data cannot give me. You can, and if you want to keep tracking this with me, subscribe, not to support a channel, but to stand with the people who want the sourced update before it becomes the news. Because the next thing I am watching is the jet stream setup heading into the back half of July. And whether that Mediterranean heat keeps building toward the danger window in the autumn, when the ocean data shifts again, I will bring it to you first. I will be reading the source tonight, the same as always, and I will report back the moment it moves. You made it all the way here with me, so let me show you where I'm taking this next. Inside the Weather Watch, I pick up right where we stopped, with the marine heat wave forecast, basin by basin. Ask me your own question, and I answer you myself. No bot. You belong with the storm watchers already in there. Just point your phone's camera at the code on screen. Cancel any time. One click.